Hello and welcome to another episode. Today I'd like to discuss a video that is doing the rounds on social discussing the potential harms of a very low to no carb diet by Dr. James. Now, James has suggested that low carb diets cause numerous amounts of problems and it's something that we shouldn't be doing long term. So I'd like to get into this a little bit today. So James suggests that the brain uses 120 grams of glucose each day, with the requirement for the red blood cells being around 30 grams each day, giving us a total requirement of 150 grams of glucose each day. Now, what he's suggesting during the protein wasting is that the body doesn't make enough glucose naturally through gluconeogenesis and can lead to a whole host of problems, including protein wasting, kidney function conditions, thyroid problems, increased cortisol, and so on and so forth. So let's get into this today. Now, the issue when we look at these rates of glucose metabolism by the cells is that they are estimated. No one knows for sure at what rate. Everything is estimated and suggested and approximated. We don't actually know is the truth. And if you hit the internet and you start to search for research papers and evidence of the capacity that the cell uses glucose, we get a very, very mixed opinion and very opposing views on glucose consumption, with some ranging from as little as 2 grams for the entire day up to 900 grams each day. So depending on the input, the output in the search engine is very different. Now, this is something that I've struggled with because I've tried to be fair with this. I've tried to establish the most consistent way of glucose consumption by the red blood cell. Now, the study on the top, again, estimated. So this is estimated in a typical 70 kilogram adult with approximately 2 litres of red blood cells. So it could be 2 to 2.5, consistent of about 3% of total body mass. The red blood cells consume roughly 20 grams. So this could be 20 to 25. So pretty close to the figure that James has represented. But again, still slightly lower. And again, if we look at another method, which basically measures the amount of moles of glucose per second, and we multiply this over the course of the day, based on the assumption of 25 trillion red blood cells, and again, it is an assumption, it's an approximation, over a 24-hour period, this suggests that the average adult will consume or require 4.3 to 6.5 grams of glucose each day. So this is considerably less than James's suggestion. Now, other suggestions, and again, suggestions, these things keep popping up. One suggestion recommends that red blood cells use 2 to 3 micromoles of glucose each day. And again, if we assume 25 trillion cells, and given the fact that we know the molecular weight of glucose, which is 180 grams per mole, then this will give us a combined requirement of 9 to 13.5, depending on whether it's 2 or 3 micromoles. So this is considerably lower than James's suggestion of 30 grams each day. And then I found another method to calculate this, which looks at 50 to 75 millimoles of glucose. And again, using the same process of the molecular weight, which we know of glucose being 180 grams per mole. This gives us a similar, or in fact, it's the same 9 to 13.5 grams of glucose each day. So this is considerably lower, but we don't know. And this is a very important fact. It's so easy to look at numbers and approximations and guesstimations. What we see in the real world is very different to what we find in a lab setting. And the issue is this research has never been done on groups of people who have been low carb, ketogenic and carnivore for prolonged periods of time. The issue is the diet is deemed to be not sustainable. People like James posting things like this will put people off, therefore less people are actually carrying out this lifestyle and reaping all of the benefits. So the studies that we see are guesstimations, estimations, assumptions, and so on and so forth. They don't show us what is going on in the real world. But let's move on. So the next assumption by James is the brain requires 120 grams of glucose each day. This I agree with. In a normal state, all of the research that I found suggests that it is around about this amount. And this is one of the studies that highlights this. This is done by Kinane and al. in 2016, which provides an extensive review of how the brain utilizes ketones, especially in a state of ketosis. In this review, it is suggested that once the body becomes adapted to a ketogenic lifestyle, the brain's reliance on glucose can drop significantly. In this adapted state, ketones can provide up to 70 to 80%. So this is in line with what James has recommended, with glucose accounting for a much smaller amount or proportion of even less than 20%. So there are room for movement here. There is room for movement. So James is suggesting 70%. This study shows potentially as much as 80%. Now again, what constitute an adapted state? Because in my personal experience, very few people live the lifestyle long enough to become what I class as keto adapted. And I genuinely believe that this can take in excess of 12 months and beyond. And there is research to support this. So if we look into these studies, all of these studies suggest that the upregulation of specific transporters, particularly the monocarboxylate transporters and the associated enzymes BDH, ACAT and SCOT, to name a few, allow us to upregulate these pathways. So even the cells that are heavily reliant on glucose within the brain, such as the glutamanergic neurotransmitters, dopaminergic, the hippocampus and so on, they can all be upregulated to the capacity of which they can utilize ketones by as much as 95%. Now this is a big difference. 95% of the brain's energy can be supplied by ketones given enough time to upregulate these monocarboxylate transporters. So if we look at the research, if we look at James's suggestion, 80% of the brain would use 24. So this is a fair meet in the middle grounds, if you like. He says 70%. The research that I think he's alluding to even suggests up to 80. So based on 80, that's 24 grams. So the requirement for the brain is 24 grams, considerably less than James's recommendation. 95% of the brain uses as little as 6 grams if we upregulate those monocarboxylate transporters and the associated enzymes. So there's a big difference. There's a big difference between somebody gravitating into this lifestyle and someone who has been living the lifestyle for a long period of time and has adapted to living this lifestyle, which I would argue is our natural metabolic state, by the way. We don't adapt to become ketogenic. We've become adapted to using glucose because it predominates in the diet. And once we remove glucose, all of these systems, pathways and enzymes are upregulated and our body's ability to use them becomes way, way more efficient. So if we come back to the erythrocytes or red blood cells, the actual figure that I've come to is 9 to 13.5 grams, which basically means the worst case total is around 37.5, with a more likely case in an adapted person being around 15 grams. So there's a big difference between these numbers, but even the higher number is a quarter of what James says that the body requires in an adapted state. So I would argue strongly against this. Now, I've spoken to one of the world leading blood experts who has come on board to explain to us a little bit about some of these processes. So let's get into that now.
Yeah, so this video has been doing the rounds and it's not very convincing from the very beginning because there's so many myths and misconceptions. I know you're going to get into the weeds with the numbers when we look at red blood cells, how much glucose they actually need. But for me, it's other things as well that send the old alarm bells ringing. For instance, he talks about 50% of protein is converted into glucose, and that's literally a myth, which has been proven time and time again using doubly labeled and tracing techniques for amino acids in eggs. It's been repeated as well. That's basically where they trace how much of an amino acid is converted into glucose from an egg, and it's normally between 2% to 8%. So the 50% doesn't sound true. The other thing is which by the way might sound like, oh wow, we're saying we need to eat even more carbs because that's obviously less glucose coming from the protein, but that's not the case at all. In fact, that's more than plenty when we look at the numbers for the red blood cells and for the brain health. So another thing that he mentions is this problem with being too acidic. And it is ridiculous. I have actually messaged him about this before because it's not borne out in practical clinical experience. So I've been doing private blood testing for over a decade, and I have never seen anybody on low carb keto. And these are long-term people, one 40 years, one of 21, one of 25, 15, decade. I've done 6 years, you've done 6 years, I think. So I've never seen it. I've never seen bone mineral density actually get worse on this way of eating, which is one of the things that he theorizes can happen. In fact, I've seen the reverse. I've seen bone mineral density improve. That's with DEXA scans. I know he talks about interstitial tissue and fluid, but the blood, yeah, that's tightly regulated, which we know 7.35 to 7.45 is where it should be. And that's following the Stewart model, which is basically 3 different things that you look at, which they're like levers, that you like to say. So the strong iron difference being one, and the weak acids, ATOT, and partial pressure. And then we've got these regulators that we have in our body, of course, which is breathing, for instance. I mean, that's one of the things that we do. So our compensation, we get rid of CO2. We've also got the renal regulation, which of course is excreting any acidity into the urine. So when you do a simple urine test, yes, you can see that your body is working. A urine test like that one, very simple. And we've also got the buffers like the bicarbonate, which the body makes naturally. So the body never becomes too acidic, whether it's in the blood or the interstitial tissues and fluids. That doesn't happen. We don't see it. So it's all theoretical. And of course, when you look at the numbers, which we're going to go deep into, or you've just been into as well, it doesn't make any sense. The bone health markers, which he talks about, the blood parameters, he's not even really talking about clinical outcomes in reality. This is all theoretical. And I just don't see it in clinical observations. And also when we look at studies about how much blood glucose a human body can have, how low it can go and still function normally. We have 2 really good studies, one from George Cahill, and we got that on the screen. And basically what they did was they fasted people for 30 to 60 days. So a lot of fasting. And then they infused them with 20 units of insulin, intravenous insulin. So obviously that's going to bring the blood glucose down to quite a low level. When I say quite low, no ill effects when they were down to 0.9 millimoles or 27 milligrams per deciliter. So that would be technically hypoglycemic and the alarm bell should be ringing, but these people were absolutely fine, showed no ill effects whatsoever. And for those that like the technical, the graphs and the figures, here we are. This is what we got, blood here in millimoles, going from 0 up to 6, and then we've got time along the bottom here, and we can see that this is the period of time where they put the insulin in, and we can see the ketones went down, but mainly the area of interest is the glucose. Look at that, how low that went, and they were still fine. And of course, this is where we're going to get into the beta hydroxybutyrate and how beneficial that is. And here's a second study. What I like about the fact the first study was replicated and we got exactly the same results. This was a much smaller study. It was still 9 people, but again, fasted for a prolonged time, 60 days, and again, given an infusion of insulin, and exactly the same thing, experienced no symptoms of clinical hypoglycemia. And again, very low. I'll show you the graph for that one. So there you go. That's the graph for that, and exactly the same sort of profile. We've got the glucose down here in millimoles, and we've got the beta hydroxybutyrate up here, what the levels are, and then insulin is infused intravenously, and you can see that the blood glucose goes down. And again, this isn't as pronounced at the end here, but we're down probably to 0.9 again when it comes to millimoles, which again is about 28 milligrams per deciliter. So replicated using actual people. It's not theoretical. It's not a whiteboard with a load of sums. These are actual people and actual results.
Okay, so circling back to this whole protein wasting. Now, again, as I said earlier, it's so easy to find figures and estimations, guesstimations, approximations, so on and so forth. But what happens in the real world is the question. Are there people out there who have been living low carb or very low carb, ketogenic or carnivore based lifestyles for prolonged periods of time? And the answer is yes. I have been living this lifestyle for well over a decade. Around 12 years I've been low carb, ketogenic and carnivore, to which I regard myself as being zero carb, which basically means I do eat organ meats occasionally. So my consumption of glucose is pretty much zero, but certainly below 2 grams each day. And I've lived this way for a very, very long time. As I say, I've been living this lifestyle for over a decade. So how has all of these things that James mentioned, how they affected me? Do I have research to back up or to maybe disprove some of James's theories? Well, let's get into this. So one of James's claims is that long-term, very low-carb diets cause us to waste protein. Now, this is a picture of me a few years ago after winning the British or European Championship. I can't remember which one this was taken, but I went on to become a professional bodybuilder on zero carb. I was a ketogenic carnivore athlete. I went on to become British champion as a pro and eventually European champion, carb-free and anabolic-free, which is very important. So I managed to achieve this physique on very, very low carb to no carb. So I didn't have a problem building muscle. So protein wasting was clearly not an issue there for me. And I do have data to back this up further. So this is the segmental analysis on an in-body composition machine, which they say is 99% accurate to a DEXA scan. I don't completely agree with that 99% statement, but it is pretty close. So let's get into this. So as you can see, my trunk, my right arm, left arm, leg, all of these things are well over, as much as 150% on my arms is over on the protein. The BMI, body fat percentage, again, this was taken not so long after I won either the British or European Championship. I can't remember which one, but I measured at 3% there, which means I was probably competing around 2%, which isn't healthy, by the way, but it was proof of concept. It was fit for purpose. I had a goal and I managed to achieve that goal by living a low-carb, ketogenic and carnivore-based lifestyle. The obesity analysis and visceral fat. My visceral fat was 1. Now, this part is very interesting to me. If we look at this, at the time of this, my weight was 76.8 kilograms. My skeletal muscle mass, 42.8, which, as you can see, is in the over range. So protein wasting was clearly not a problem for me. Now, this is super interesting. So the above average D type, what does that mean? So let's zoom in. So if we, and I'm going to read this out, the highlighted part. This body type is typically very strong and robust and is commonly observed in athletes. The complete opposite to what James is saying in regards to the protein wasting and the bone loss and so on and so forth. All of these things just do not ring true. They have not rung true in my testing, and we've got more to get into. Now, in fact, in the in-body, my ranking at 99 points put me in the top 0.4 in all people tested within my age category. And again, at this point, I'd been living low-carb, ketogenic, carnivore way of living, maybe for 7 years, 6 or 7 years, give or take. So let's move on. So very low-carb diets cause mineral loss is another claim that James has made. So have I tested my minerals? Yes, I have. So again, protein is over, minerals is in the over range. I do not have a mineral deficiency. So what about the next part? Long-term, very low-carb diets cause damage to the kidneys. So let's look at my kidney results. My creatinine, EGFR, both in normal ranges. And in fact, my EGFR over time has actually increased. So no kidney problems. And this was done August 24, so just a few months ago. So this data has been collated for me, who has been living this lifestyle for well over a decade. So again, this is probably 12 years in the making and still no kidney damage. So just to reiterate, what happens in a lab, what happens in a textbook, and what is hypothesized is very, very different to what happens in the real world. The body adapts to this way of living. The body upregulates these pathways and enzymes and allows us not just to survive, but thrive. Now, for good measure, I've also put in there my liver health. As you can see, my bilirubin, ALP, ALT, GGT, all in perfect ranges. So the next thing that James says during his post is very low carb diets cause an increase in uric acid. So let's check my uric acid. Ridiculously low. I mean, it's almost laughable. I mean, It can get lower, but that is pretty low. So, I mean, I think this disproves so far everything and all of the claims that James has made to this point. My uric acid, ridiculously low. Very low carb diets cause thyroid damage. So let's check my thyroid. TSH, free T3, free thyroxine, my antibodies, all in normal ranges. Let's move on. Very low carb diets cause high blood pressure. Well, guess what? Yesterday, when I was prepping for this and gathering the information, I did my blood pressure. And as you can see, this was yesterday, the 24th of May, 2025, 106/76. Incredibly low. I do not suffer with high blood pressure. Again, another myth and misconception. Now, some of these things can be elicited during the transition phase. So if someone comes from a very high carbohydrate diet, for example, and then goes to low carb, the body can lose minerals, it can lose sodium, it can lose muscle protein in the initial phases. Your body's going through an adaptation process. Your body's going through lots of changes. So these things can happen, but the key to this is consistency. Consistency is key. This is all about the rule and not the exception. Providing we live an ancestral appropriate lifestyle, then these things will convert back, they will revert back to the way that they're meant to be, and these pathways and systems again will be upregulated. So these things, these claims that James is making can happen, and they do happen to most people in the short term. But most people are coming from a very sick background. They're coming from a state of high insulin resistance, and this is the type of lifestyle that reverses all of these things. So as we adjust and gravitate deeper down the lifestyle, the body adapts, and you're seeing firsthand the results of this adaptation process. So the next claim here is that very low carb diets increase cortisol. So let's check my cortisol, and this is my diurnal rhythm. As you can see, my diurnal rhythm is absolutely perfect. No issue with elevated cortisol, no stress going on within my body. No bad stress, at least. Very low carb diets cause a decrease in explosive performance. And this is almost laughable because, again, this was me during my transition. So after I'd fixed my gut and addressed my obesity and my diabetes and so on, which we'll get into, I began training, I began consuming high volumes of good quality animal proteins and natural fats with zero carb, and this allowed me to grow muscle mass at a rate of knots, quicker than I'd ever grown any muscle before. And it saw me get into quite a big size for me. I'm 5'9", I'm very, very small. My frame is quite compact and small. So this is pretty big for me. Now, at my peak, when I was around 76k, so this is not as heavy as I was at my heaviest, but this is when I contemplated competing in powerlifting, because with these stats at that time for my age category, I would have been in the top 10 in the UK, but due to a tore pec, I came away from that and I went into endurance sports, which we'll get onto. So when I was 76 kilogram, living a low carb, very low carb to no carb, ketogenic carnivore-based lifestyle, my bench press, my top bench press was 165k. Now, there are people out there who can bench press way higher than this, but I was very small. 76k is a very, very lean, small, light person. So these lifts are pretty sizable for my size at that time. 165k, which is 363 pounds for our friends over the other side of the pond. My squat was 190k, which is 418 pounds, and my deadlift 230 kilograms or 506 pounds. So these weights are pretty heavy. My body certainly isn't struggling. I have not lost any explosive power, and in fact I attribute my strength and my explosive power to my very, very low carb ketogenic carnivore based lifestyle. So I've come away from bodybuilding. I achieved everything that I wanted to there. And I've gravitated now into endurance sports. So I'm not an elite endurance athlete by any means, but this was recently taken. As you can see, yes, I've lost some size because I'm no longer lifting weights. It's been over 3 years since I've done any form of resistance training, and I'm still packing a sizable amount of muscle for someone who does not do any weight training and for someone who is meant to be protein wasting. Again, you know, I'm not an elite endurance athlete, but living this way has allowed me to achieve pretty modest times in running, considering it's something that I've adopted quite later in life. It's allowed me to achieve a 17-minute 5K, a 37-minute 10K, and an 86-minute half marathon, which I'm sure I'll be improving on shortly. But coming on from this, so I've no issue with strength or power, and clearly no issue with endurance. Now, James hasn't made any comments about endurance, but I thought it's keen to put in because it just shows how versatile this way of living is. Now, these are cycles that I've done. I'm pretty new to cycling. I've probably cycled on a bike as an adult less than 40 times. The one on the far left to you guys there is recorded as just under 105. This was in fact 112, but it's been misrecorded. This was the Ironman Loop in Wales, which is known as one of the toughest courses. Now, I don't do an awful lot of riding. It's a bit of a hobby for me, but that day I achieved 112 miles. But let's go with the 104 that's on there because that's what's recorded. Now, this was a moving time of over 7 hours on zero carb. So I was 16 hours fasted, zero carb. I didn't consume anything during my ride other than water and electrolytes. And this is a big feat for someone who doesn't ride these distances, which just goes to show that energy during that period of time is not of a concern for someone living a low-carb ketogenic lifestyle. This one shows an increased power, 250 watts over 28 miles, so it shows that we can sustain power for a prolonged period of time. And this one, which was my first 80-mile ride, which I did on one bottle of water, and again, 16 hours fasted. All of these were 16 hours fasted. These times and distances and powers are not brilliant, but for someone who is new to cycling and endurance sports, they're not too shabby, which just adds more weight to the fact that a low-carb ketogenic way of living is not just better for power, but it is superior for endurance also, in my opinion. Now, this used to be me. So many would say that, you know, you are genetically gifted, because I used to be clinically obese. I was once insulin resistant, suffered with daily debilitating migraines that would make me blind, chronic fatigue, depression, anxiety, arthritic pains, high blood pressure, which is one of the things that James says that living this way causes. Well, I used to suffer with high blood pressure, and now I do not. Living low carb for a prolonged period of time has reversed my high blood pressure. Depression, anxiety, I had severe teeth problems, IBS, so on and so forth. Now, what many may argue is that I am genetically gifted, and this is why I've been able to achieve the things that I've achieved. But I would argue the opposite. Now, this was my father. He died in his early 60s. And as you can see, this is where I was going. You can see me in his face. This was my fate. This is what my genetics had in store for me. And I managed to beat these. I managed to beat my genetics via something called epigenetics, which I've achieved by living a low-carb, ketogenic and carnivore-based lifestyle. So this is real data. This is real-world data. You may think that this is an isolated case. I promise you this is not. With all of the athletes and clients I work with across the board, I work with clients who once suffered with diabetes, with IBS, intestinal permeability, all the way up to other autoimmune issues. Across the board, I work with clients from all walks of life to achieve lots of different things. We see these results across the board in every case. In everyone that's come to see me, we've either seen a massive improvement or complete resolution when this person is committed to living a long-term low-carb ketogenic lifestyle and has allowed their body to adapt and upregulate the pathways and the enzymes that we mentioned earlier. And that's the thing. These research papers are not done on people who are living these lifestyles for a prolonged period of time. So coming back to James's original statements, protein wasting. We've just disproven this. Mineral loss. Well, we've just disproven this. Elevated cortisol. Well, my cortisol is not elevated, not a problem. Kidney damage. My kidneys are in perfect working order. Elevated uric acid, and this was laughable because, as you saw, mine was rock bottom. No issues with elevated uric acid. Thyroid resistance. My thyroid is absolutely perfect. Loss of explosive power. Again, almost laughable. And again, constipation, which we didn't speak about, and cramping. These are things that occur during the transition period. So they are things that people may experience, and in fact, they are very, very common, but they can be addressed and they can be negated heavily at least during the adaptation process. Once the person has become adapted, these things all go away. I no longer suffer with any of these things. So every statement that James has surmised and hypothesized based on works in a lab and estimations, guesstimations, approximations, they've all been disproven. These are not reality. This is not reality in the real world. The reality is that a low-carb, ketogenic way of living is not just not damaging, but in fact it heals the body. And this is an ancestral, appropriate lifestyle. This is the way that we would have lived our entire existence. Anytime I question things, anytime I question, am I doing things right? I always ask myself how I feel. And I always feel fantastic. Yes, I have off days, but generally I feel fantastic. I achieve things that I never thought that I could have achieved previously, certainly on a high carb and moderate carb diet. But I always look back to how we've evolved. Now, during our evolutionary period, we've been ketogenic. And in fact, if we were to put man's entire existence into a 365-day calendar, we've been ketogenic for 364. So it's only since the introduction of modern grains have we come away from this way of living. We're not just carnivore, we are hyper-carnivore, which means that we would have consumed not just animal proteins, but we would have hunted and caught and killed and eaten other carnivores. We are hyper-carnivore, and we know this through nitrogen isotope testing. We are carnivore. Yes, we would have consumed fruit, but fruit is seasonal. We would have consumed it at the end of the summer in order to fatten us up for a cold winter, which should tell you everything that you need to know about carbohydrate. Fruits and vegetables, as we see everywhere else in the world, didn't exist in the forms that they exist today. Berries were a lot smaller. Apples in the UK were tiny little crab apples, for example, which were very sour. They're not the types of things that we would have consumed all year round, and certainly not in excess. Tubers and roots, minimal amounts. These are survival foods. These are survival foods. Animal proteins are thriving foods. So anytime you question anything, take it back to our evolutionary appropriate diet. This is what we've evolved on and thrived on our entire existence. Low carb or very low carb, ketogenic and carnivore lifestyles, in my opinion, are the healthiest way to live. Now, for more information, you can find me on YouTube under Richard Smith Nutrition. I run a school group with Stephen Thomas, which is low carb. So check that out. That's a fantastic service. Stephen and I are in there live twice a week for Q&A. That's my website there, theketopro.com. Lots of free information available there. And I'm also available for consultations. So if you feel like you need additional information, you can join the lives, which are free. Stephen and I are live in there every Sunday at 7 p.m. for free live Q&A. If you want additional information, I'm available for consultations. All of these will be in the comments or the links below. Thanks again for listening. Take care, and I will see you soon.